Hi, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy, the Executive Clinical Director at Evoke Therapy Programs. Happy to have you this evening. For those of you that are joining us live, you can submit questions at any time during the broadcast. I don't have pre-planned content. We'll take a couple of questions left over from Monday evening that we didn't get to. If you're a sibling of an Evoke client, let me know your age or the age of the sibling, the child that you're asking for. And if you're a relative other than a primary guardian, please let me know your relationship, uncle, aunt, close family friend. That's really helpful to give me that context. So with that precursor, you can submit questions to Cassidy, who's helping me moderate this evening. She'll hold those and she'll pass those on. But I'll get to the first couple of questions which are left over from the other evening. Somebody wrote, please explain the difference between an excuse and a justification. We heard your explanation in a recent webinar, but do not agree with the example that was given. Can we hear this again? Maybe we missed something. I don't think it's the difference between an excuse and a justification. It's the difference between an explanation and a justification. And it's really a simple technical point that it's hard to argue with, actually. An explanation, I'll go to justification first. A justification is a defense mechanism. And a defense mechanism involves a feeling of threat. So when somebody is justifying themselves, they're feeling threatened. An explanation is just an explanation. And the way you know the difference between the two is that if somebody cuts you off during an explanation, I don't want to hear that right now, it's much easier to let it go. But if they interrupt you and cut you off during a justification, you're going to feel compelled to share it because the justification is an attempt to protect yourself from a perceived threat. So one is a defense mechanism and one is just words. And like everything we talk about, it might be a continuum, right? And that would lend itself to more or less need for the person to provide the information, the explanation or justification. But that's essentially what it is. And what I find fascinating about justification, before I go on to the second question, is justification is evidence of somebody being in relationships and contexts where they had to prove themselves. The choice, the decision, the behavior, the reaction, the feeling, whatever it is, has to have merit, right? It has to be good or right or approved of. So that's part of where that comes from. The goal for a therapist, and you can borrow this as a parent, of course, the goal is to be with the client in such a way that they don't need to justify themselves. They don't feel like they have to prove to you. I share the example where one person came to me telling me that it took them 6 months to convince the child's therapist that the mother was justified in wanting a divorce from her husband. And my response to her was, it wouldn't have taken you 6 minutes. In fact, I wouldn't even been inclined to believe that you needed to prove to me that it was the right thing to do. And at first she was taken back by that idea, like I wouldn't approve of it, but that's not my job. That's not my role in people's lives, is to pronounce judgment on what's right and acceptable for them. So that's what that relates to. Again, submit questions at any time. The second question says, I have a daughter in group 4 currently. Is there a difference in how the program is run during the holidays? On the specific holidays, we celebrate them. That's number one. They get special food, more games. We try to introduce some traditions. If children celebrate various religious holidays, we ask everybody to celebrate that holiday with and to learn about it. So those are the differences on the holiday. We try not to make a big difference. We try not to shift the schedule of activities too much, except for the day itself. In and around the day, it's the same kind of work. And if you look at the or listen to the podcast on winter and wilderness therapy, you'll hear me say over and over again that I think the program is more impactful naturally in the wintertime, because the idea of primitive living wilderness therapy is that you can take nothing for granted. And the simple adage, for example, of you reap what you sow, you don't have to teach a farmer that adage. The farmer knows it innately. But in our society today, with you might have a parent that's an accountant or an attorney, and a child growing up where money comes out of an ATM, the law of the harvest is hard to teach a child naturally in the course of families that are middle class or upper class. It's hard to teach that. And so primitive living is a kind of a cultural immersion into a different time, to a different socioeconomic class, so to speak, where everything takes work. Everything has to be earned. Taking a shower is not just the same as it is at home. Lots of preparations. Keeping your toes and your fingers dry and warm is not something that you can take for granted. And because we live inside, because we enjoy the creature comforts we all enjoy, it's very, very easy to take these things for granted. So it takes a kind of a mindfulness. I remember I was giving a very short presentation along with a couple of other treatment centers. And one that is very posh and high level was describing how they had something like 17 types of pillows for their guests at their recovery, their therapeutic program. And the person telling the story said that when she was in recovery, that she found herself distracted for weeks because she couldn't get the right pillow. So that was one of her commitments, was to get the right pillows for their clients. And I went afterwards and I thought, our clients don't get pillows. They ball their clothes up in a ball in a laundry bag and they sleep on that. And then when they struggle with it, that becomes the therapy. It becomes a metaphor or a microcosm for the things that don't go well in life. So winter programming is more like that. Summer programming, although each of the seasons have their challenge, but the moderate temperature seasons in Utah and Oregon where we operate, some of it can feel, that pleasant enough that some of those lessons aren't as powerful, or the volume isn't turned up as loudly. Somebody says, please explain the difference between maintaining a boundary as opposed to enforcing a consequence. Well, a consequence can come out of a boundary. A boundary is the line that you draw in your life about what you are and aren't willing to tolerate, what you are and aren't okay with. The consequence is just the enforcement of that, the exercise of that. Boundaries are for self-care, self-preservation. Consequences, of course, are to manage the behavior of the people around you. Natural and logical consequences are recommended, are according to behavioral studies and theory, they're more effective than contrived experiences. So natural and logical are so boundaries is the larger umbrella, and then consequences are ways that you enforce that in your relationships. Somebody says, please address why we should not be proud of our child's accomplishments. I know I've heard this a number of times in your webcast, but it's a tough one for me to get my head around. It just comes out so naturally. I get that. It does for me too sometimes. And I'm going to use the wording of your question to illustrate a few points, because so please bear with me for a moment. The first thing I want to address in your question is the first line in your question is why we should not. Why we should not. So you've already framed the question in a way that I never said it. There's no should involved in this. There's no moral imperative. And I've shared with you all many times when psychology became the predominant lens in my life through which to see the world, I thought that I had disposed of shame because I wasn't seeing it necessarily through a religious dogma, a religious tradition. And then I realized that shame just came with me. It just attached itself to psychological principles. So your should makes sense to me, but it's not about should or should, and it's not even about the feeling. It's just, here's what it is. It loads heavily. The child is likely to hear, interpret, believe that it's their responsibility to take care of your feelings, to make you feel a certain thing. And the fact of the matter is, growing up means you're going to have to learn to disappoint your parents. You know, when my mother tells me she's proud, which she does in my adult life, it doesn't matter to me because I didn't do any of this for her. None of it. She's proud of how she sees me as a father. It was never for her. So it doesn't matter to me. I mean, the reason that I discourage, and I don't draw a really thick, hard line with this, but the reason I discourage it and ask people to be very reluctant is because you don't want, ideally, you don't want your children to be looking at you to figure out whether or not they're good or worthy or not. They want to look at you for safety, for security, for soothing, for groundedness. And so they've got to develop a self, and that's going to be messy. And that means they're going to have to learn to disappoint people, starting with you. There's a saying in Al-Anon that says, what other people think about me is none of my business. And that applies to parents. If their esteem is based on whether or not you're pleased or proud of them, that will wire them to enter into the world, into relationships, believing that it's their job to make other people happy. And you don't want that. And their brain, at a very deep level, will not distinguish between the boyfriend, the girlfriend, the peer, the colleague, the whomever, eventually the child. They will not distinguish between those others and the parent. So if they grow up believing that making mom and dad proud is important, then they're going to believe that making boyfriends and girlfriends and spouses and colleagues and friends, making them feel proud and impressed is also important. And perhaps worse, in the end, is they'll transfer that onto the child. In other words, they'll start to believe that what the child thinks about them is about them. And it's their job to make their child happy, right? Which is where we come in as parents. That's part of our work. It starts with our own parents, learning to disappoint them, learning to let them down. That's an important part of growing up, but also learning to disappoint our children and let them down too. So that's kind of a long answer to it. And I was a little bit nitpicky with your wording, but it's very important, very important. Somebody says, I understand parents and child may need some separation during the wilderness therapy experience. That said, we have not had any meaningful conversation with our son for 4 months. We are totally disconnected, and we know he is suffering. How much separation is needing, and how do you weigh that against the parents' need to be to help a suffering 15-year-old? It's different for everybody. And COVID has presented some challenges for sure. You know, having parents out to the field to visit was a regular process pre-COVID. It will come back into the program when it's safe to have visitors into the field and to not put clients and students at risk. So all of that is true. Ask it of your therapist. I mean, your point is valid. Your question is valid. But there are answers. I can think of a half a dozen off the top of my head ways that I might answer that question if I were in a position as the therapist to believe that we would limit the phone calls. One of the things I've done is when I couldn't have visits in the past, not related to the pandemic, but something else, is I would let the child talk to the parents for an hour unsupervised at some point, more than once. Not because I think everything was going to go perfect, but because I think there's value in kind of getting back into it in an unsupervised context. So you start off with letters, you move toward phone calls with the therapist, and if it goes long enough, if it went long enough, my clients would have unsupervised phone calls with their parents. And then we would process afterwards. Was there regression? Were there old behaviors, old buttons being pushed, and so forth? So I don't know if the therapist is directing limited amounts of communication. I don't know the reason why. I can think of justifiable reasons why that would be appropriate. But you'll have to ask them and listen to intelligent answers and propose that you want to have phone calls, and if you already had supervised phone calls, unsupervised phone calls, so you see what it's like without the eyes of the therapist on it. My daughter is home from therapeutic boarding school, and now excuse me, my daughter's home from a therapeutic boarding school for a holiday visit. She has completed wilderness, 1 year at a therapeutic boarding school, and at another therapeutic boarding school. She is 16 years old. We have a reoccurring symptom of two. We have a reoccurring symptom or two. She has an addiction to screens and social media. A boundary in our house is no Snapchat. She has logged on to Snapchat many, many times each day. When confronted, she lies, gets very defensive, and will not admit to it. I want to be a safe container, but hold a boundary. What do you suggest? I mean, my first reaction to this is perfect. This is the perfect situation where when she goes back, she's not done. It sounds like this is just a holiday visit. Talk about it. Get curious. Stay curious. In the big picture, you're holding some really tough boundaries. But the lying, the deceit, the inability to respect boundaries in the home, all of that I'm sure is related to some of the reasons that she probably went to therapeutic boarding school or wilderness in the first place. So talk about it and get curious. Try to remove the judgment for now. Don't fight the battle, but don't lose yourself in the battle, but realize you're fighting a bigger war, and enter it with curiosity and have it be grist for the mill. Talk about it as, look, this happened. I don't want to go back there. We've already been there. What do I need to do? Ask the therapist, ask your daughter. What do you need to do so that we don't go back into these old patterns? Because this is not the way that we want to live our lives. So what do we each need to do? See if we can get there. Someone said, follow-up question about the holidays. Because of COVID, what we are missing out on, how does it miss the in-person visit affect our experience? Well, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but Evoke was the first wilderness therapy program anywhere to have parents in the field mid-program. That didn't exist, and we started doing it. So for years before we did it, it wasn't happening. And what you miss is the anticlimax of sitting with your child. A consultant, an educational consultant, said to me many years ago, when we started to have more and more parents in the field mid-visit, she said to me, you're creating a dynamic where you take away the climax of the graduation. The graduation is becoming anticlimactic. And when she first said that, I was defensive. And the reason I was defensive is because she was right. Then I thought about it for a few days in between our weekly phone calls. And I realized by the second week, I thought, good. I'm glad that it's anticlimactic, because life is not climactic. So visits give you real, tangible, practical practice of being together. The reunion, the celebration of being together again, that's wonderful, and it doesn't last long, right? The honeymoon goes pretty quickly. The real value that I think the old in-person visits added is it gives you time to spend time where it's not all therapy. Have dinner together, sit around the campfire, work on putting the shelter together, sleep in a sleeping bag next to each other, right? It's all of those activities that aren't necessarily therapy. So if you can find ways to have, we're trying, to have video exchanges or unsupervised phone calls so that you can have replicate that experience. That's ideal. That's why I love therapeutic schools that give visits, holiday visits at some point, because you want to practice, and failure is the thing you want to practice the most. I think, well, I know therapists who work in programs. I think what they have been doing for years is protecting the family, insulating the family, and not wanting things to go sideways. More and more and more at Evoke, of course. Like I said, we were the first ones to have families in the program, mid-program. Um, but more and more and more, we want you to struggle. We want your child to struggle. We don't want to create it. We don't want it to be contrived or forced, but we want you to have opportunities to test out the new skills and new relationship. I've told the story before, but I had a mother. I remember she called me after a visit to her son. Who they visited some colleges because he was after his therapeutic boarding school. A couple of months afterwards, he would be going into college, and so he left with her. And she called me and she said there were really some old behaviors from my son, but she said that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling to tell you how excited I am that I didn't do what I used to do. And for me, that was gold. Yes, the child regressed. How did you deal with it? Did you have new tools and a different response to the old behaviors? That's the gold. That's the magic of it. So I think that's the downside of less family contact in this kind of safe, contained environment. The we try to replicate it the best we can. We always talk about with therapeutic programming, the more special it is, the bigger the step down, right? If it becomes a really sacred, special, contained experience, when they get back into the real world, the real, the world of the profane, if you will, the world as opposed to the sacred, the world of the everyday, is that too big of a drop off to handle? So that's why in residential situations we try to give as much exposure as we can as we go along to practice and to deal with each other's failures. So looks like we don't have any more questions for right now. So I'll go to upcoming events, and then by the end, Cassidy, if there are more questions, I will go to them. As you all know, if you've been listening and watching, the Audacity to Be You is out on audiobook. And I narrated it this time. So both the books are available on Amazon and Audible and iTunes. So you can go there to get them there. And the most recent one, the Audacity to Be You, has been narrated by me. So I was very happy to be able to do that. If you want to do a deep dive, if you want to do your own work, even if you don't know what that work is, but you really want to unravel yourself and understand brick by brick what makes you up, your personality, and how that relates to your spouse, your extended family, your children, your parenting struggles and challenges. I do an intensive. I do them myself. I think that we pay for our therapists to do them. We pay for our managers to do them. I paid for my children. My wife has done one. We believe in these. I refer when people can't come to our program. I recommend they go to, because they know me or they know us, go to other places. Our staff are exceptional. It is an attachment-based program. It is clinically based, so it's not just self-help. We use psychodrama. It's a great deep dive, a great springboard to your work, a great accelerator if you've already done a lot of your work, and you learn as much by watching other people and their work as you do with your own. So our next online group, and we have some space available, is January 13th through 15th. And then in person, I'll be running the one in person February 24th through 28th. And because in Utah, I'm actually a frontline worker, I'll be getting my COVID shots before then. So at least one more person in the room will be immune, or at least protected, I should say. If you want to attend a Finding You 2, if you've attended a Finding You 1, our next in-person session will be April 28th through May 2nd. I can't wait for that. Those are so wonderful. We have a spring break trip plan coming up March 12th through 14th, ages 18 and older. It's a multi-sport program, hiking, canyoneering, and yoga in southern Utah. This can be between programs. It can be family fun with some therapy support. It can be a therapy kind of reconnect. Think therapy light, very light, but adventure. But we have custom trips and programs. Just email Sarah, SARA, at evoketherapy.com for questions. Upcoming parent support groups, December 17th, obviously. January 7th will be our next online parent support group, 6:30 Mountain Time. And then our next intensives alumni support group will be January 12th. Any questions with these anytime, or to make sure that you have the right links, contact Malia at evoketherapy.com. We ask all current parents to go to any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children. Adult Children is a really great program for if you want to look at your own family of origin through the critical lens of mental health. It's a great program. You don't have to have an alcoholic or overtly scary abusive parent to qualify for that. RefugeRecovery.org and NAMI.org are great resources also in communities, free and affordable resources in your communities. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app. Just go to your favorite podcast app and search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast. Subscribe, rate us, share there. Or you can go to soundcloud.com on your computer to find us. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at using the handle at Evoke Therapy. Or you can find the intensives program on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. Evoke Therapy programs and Evoke Therapy Intensives are available are also on Facebook by searching those names, and of course the blog has live content each week. Have any new questions come in? Looks like they have. I'm noticing, somebody writes, I'm noticing as my child is getting better at her RTC, Residential Treatment Center, and we are able to navigate difficult discussions, that now we are struggling more as a couple. Is this normal? Thank you for sharing that. Yes, of course. Human beings, it's called triangulation. We take I'll give you the best example. If I was your therapist, you could come to me and you could talk about your spouse, your child, your friends, your mother, your father, your family of origin, and I can hold space for that pretty easily. The scariest moment is when you start talking to me about me, how I am with you as a therapist, right? Those other outlets are kind of anxiety outlets, and a child who's struggling can be an anxiety outlet. So when that subsides somewhat or gets better even, yes, our angst, our anxiety, our difficulties are going to show up in other intimate relationships because that becomes an outlet, a distraction, for lack of a better word. None of it's conscious or intentional. But what you said is more true than not, more common than I think most people would think, would imagine. Somebody writes, my son is in his my son is 15th and in his 8th week at Evoke, and will probably be moving to a therapeutic boarding school next. I've been reading some of the books that you have recommended, such as Parenting from the Inside Out, to work more on myself and improve our connection. However, he was just diagnosed with ASD, autism spectrum disorder. We expected this, but he is more on the spectrum than we thought. Do you have any suggestions on the book, such as Parenting from the Inside Out, that also includes how that emotional connection works with kids on the spectrum? I don't specifically. That's not to say that Parenting from the Inside Out or The Journey of the Heroic Parent don't apply. Um, I think it requires a maybe more bandwidth than some other diagnosis because it's so atypical. The child, the way that they think and process is so uncommon and foreign to you, to a parent who's not atypical. So in that sense, you need more capacity and more bandwidth. Um, in some ways, it's not fundamentally different than having a child that's an addict or a child that's depressed and anxious, in the sense that, the job of being a parent with children and children that struggle is we have to figure out how to take care of ourselves first, right? How to find and feed ourselves first so that we can compassionately support the people that we love. Some people are going to require more support than other people. An addict, a depressed person, somebody with an eating disorder, somebody on the spectrum are going to require more and different things. The specific skills with ASD, I don't know off the top of my head a good book to learn about. Uh, I'll post that next time. Cassie, if you can make a note, I'll post some of those next time that we have a broadcast, and get this person's name so I can email them the list when I talk to a couple of my colleagues. Somebody asked the question, how often would you recommend an intensive? I've had one with Travis and found it very, very beneficial. Travis is our clinical director. As often as you want. I do them once a year, but I've done 9 or 10 of them. I did one once. I did them two in 1 year, because I did a couples one along with a men's intensive. Um, it's whatever feels right to you. It's for, if you need that reconnection. Having done 9 or 10 of them, I've lost count now. The quality of my work is significant over the years, from year to year, right? More and more and more clear. In fact, I didn't do one this year. This is the first time because of COVID. But each year prior and last year specifically, I remember realizing how the last couple actually that I did, I was very clear with the facilitator about what I needed and kind of set up my own work without needing a lot of help or direction from him. So as often as you want, I don't have a limit to it. It's just more therapy as often as your own personal resources would allow. I do them yearly, but if you're thinking about a Finding You too, the one in April could be a good touchstone for you and to see. But you're really building upon. I remember, I think I've told you that one of the things that one of the people told me in my very first intensive is they said to me, "I think you're being a therapist is getting in the way of some of your work." And when I told my therapist that many days later, she said, "What a strange thing to say to you." She said, "I've never found you being a therapist as an impediment to your work. I've seen it as an asset." So what I think that person was telling me is my being a therapist was challenging to them. Right? In some way, they were feeling threatened or bothered by it. But my work builds on what I know, builds on my growth. I do better work now than I did 10 years ago because I've worked all and in between that. So I don't have an amount about too much or too little. I can tell you I do it once a year. I've done one twice a year. And check in on yourself. Go again and see what it feels like. Somebody writes, pre-COVID, is it accurate that parents attended a graduation ceremony? If so, is there a possibility that the field staff could FaceTime us during the ceremony? Probably not FaceTime. Film them, yes. But the satellite phones are what we use in most of our field area, and those don't lend themselves to video chats, video conference, right? There's no cell phone service out there. So probably not, but we could film it. It's usually fairly simple and ceremonious. Yes, they come for a ceremony that involves a group, but it's very personal. I can bring that up with our staff. Cassidy, if you'll make another note just for me to bring up about the idea about FaceTiming ceremonies, or I should say, I'm sorry, not FaceTiming, recording, video recording ceremonies. We don't want to be too intrusive also. So, but we'll throw it around a little bit and see what we come up with. Someone writes, our son is new to Evoke and will be turning 18 while in the wilderness and is only in his junior year of high school. He is dead set against going to another therapeutic boarding school. At least he was before he left. I'm wondering how many options he has, being that coming home immediately is not really a viable option right afterwards. Lots and lots and lots of options. And every child turning 18, I don't know if I've ever seen an exception. I'm sure that there are, but every child turning 18 threatens that they're going to walk away and that they're not going to tolerate it. So you have a long way to go, and we just kind of work with it slowly. There are plenty of options for that age group, many options for that age group. Your Evoke therapist and your educational consultant can help develop those choices and options and work with your child. But virtually every individual turning 18 threatens to leave at 18 or to leave if they get sent to another program. But it's something that it's part of the therapeutic progress. It's part of the treatment plan, is to get them to a place where they will accept and own and invest in that decision. Someone says, do the therapists or field counselors ever get asked to write college recommendations for a student? I mean, yes, for sure. I just trying to scan my brain how common. I've had a few college recommendations, but I've had 1,100 clients, so it's not a high number. But on occasion, I think what's more common is I have many college essays from former students of mine that I've been able to read, where they talk about this experience as a part of their college essay assignment. That is really, really common, but not necessarily recommendations a month. I think I've had a couple. I've had some job recommendations for sure, more of those. What are the best parent tools that we can offer you? I'm glad you asked. Listen to or watch the 8 tools. I also wrote a blog about it, and it's also an expanded version of it is in one of the chapters of my book. So the 8 tools for transforming relationships, or sometimes I think I call it 8 tips. It's a chapter in my book. It's a podcast already, and it's a blog on our website. Those are the 8 things that I have found over the years to be the most effective. And as I talk about, particularly in the book, they don't fix the problem. But if we allow tools to, they transform and change us. Right? They teach us as we use and we fit ourselves into them. They change us. We learn from them. And as I told my staff when I was going, in fact, my next in-service with our staff is going over the 8 tools. What I tell my staff is, it doesn't make you enlightened, but if you were enlightened, you would use these 8 tools and it would be automatic for you. They would be intrinsic for you. So, but we do learn from the outside in sometimes. Sometimes we move from awareness to behavior change. But in the case of tools, why I like tools, and I'm not a big tool guy, but why I do like tools is because they can change us. They can change the way that we think, the way that we relate. Somebody writes, we have a Snapchat issue at our house too. Social media, isn't it a treat? We have a Snapchat issue at our house too. Our son's behavior sounds identical to that described in the initial Snapchat question. In the heat of the moment, when confronted about his use of the app that we don't allow, the last thing he wants to do is have a therapy-like discussion about why he broke the rule and lied about it. How do we have a meaningful discussion at the moment? I mean, at the moment, you might not. At the moment, remember, at that moment, he's feeling threatened. He's warding off feelings of bad, of wrong, right? Those are the principal threats to the human psyche. I am bad or wrong or unlovable or unworthy. So don't, the principle that I talk about all the time is strike while the iron is cold. I can't have a therapy discussion, a therapy like discussion when I'm feeling upregulated, anxious, agitated, or threatened. My wife is a clinician. She can't have one either. Nobody can. That's why the eighth tool on the eight tools is timeout. You have to down regulate your nervous system. And so, what you're telling me, which makes a lot of sense, is nobody can when they get in trouble. Nobody can. But what you try to do is not contribute to escalating. Find a time when the iron is cold and ask yourself, a CEO once told me that after doing an intensive, he went back to his board at work, and he asked the board members at his work, he said, I want feedback. I want to know what I'm doing as a boss that may be creating a culture where people don't feel safe in the workplace, emotionally safe. And he said, nobody said a word. And he said, that told me everything. Their silence, their unwillingness to give me feedback told me how unsafe I was. So some of this work, a lot of this work you're doing on your own in your relationships. Somebody says, I'm stuck, Dr. Reedy. I need to share my truth with my wife. I have invited her into the relationship circle and my request is ignored. I am trying to identify and share my truth. Do your own work. In the meantime, um, find ways to gently invite it, but ultimately, we cannot control others' willingness and ability to show up in the relationship, to show up in the space. So I only have empathy for you. Keep doing your work in the meantime, because regardless of how it turns out, it will be the same work for you. Somebody says it feels like there's a huge chasm between outpatient therapy and residential in terms of mental health services. Before my son was in residential, I tried to create as many protective factors as possible, but honestly, there just wasn't enough. Thoughts? I think you're right. I mean, the reason why I like residential for adolescents and young adults who aren't necessarily opting in, right? Older adults opt into treatment if it's required, or sometimes people in their family intervene and they'll choose from that intervention to go to treatment. But because the adolescent brain, which goes until about 25, is not fully developed, and sometimes beyond that. And so the experience of residential, the comprehensive nature of residential, the immersive nature of residential, and all that everybody in that setting is able to do together, from teacher to nurse to administrative staff that work there, to the therapist, of course, to the frontline staff, and to the peers, it's not even close. I tell my therapist all the time, told him this 2 days ago, yesterday, don't get too arrogant about your skill set when you're working in wilderness. It does a lot of the work for you, even more than in residential. So yeah, we have most of the work is done outside of the therapy session. Most of the work is I've told you, you can Google this. Google NASA, comma, Harvard and wilderness therapy. And you will see articles from Harvard and research from NASA that says when they bring teams together to build trust, using primitive living wilderness experiences is more effective than any contrived game or exercise, because it creates vulnerability, and it requires trust and cooperation. And those are all of the things that are precursors to exposing your skill sets around communication and relationships. So yeah, we have a huge advantage. I think there's another one here. Uh, Somebody writes, in chapter 1 of The Audacity to Be You, you mention the father diving in and confronting the unconscious aspects of himself. Can you please touch on what might be an example of this work? I think the story that I tell is I think it was in church, and this man was telling a story about a dream that he'd had where uh, his son, his young adult son, was swimming out into a poisoned garbage filled pond or lake, and he sat at the shore watching his son and watching his son struggle in the garbage and the toxins in the lake, and eventually I don't know if the son drowned, but getting to that point where he was going to drown. And the father told this story, believing that the imagery for him meant that the lake represented the world and the temptations of the world, and that he couldn't help his son because his son was venturing out into those worldly sins, if you will, or pleasures, and that those would drag him down. And I makes sense to me why he would interpret that. But what I know from being trained and what I'm trained for, there's great metaphor imagery in that too, where um, part of it is you have to deal and dive into your own darkness. You have to understand your mental health issues. Most parents can relate to this. If not, it doesn't have to fit you, but you have to deal with your anxiety disorder, your attempts to control. You have to. There's a phrase that I read somebody shared that says, "Growing up will expose the emotional immaturity of your parents." So what this can do if you allow it to, and what I mean by that is walk into an Al-Anon meeting. They're free and anonymous. Those 6 meetings that we ask you to go to, that's what that means. That would be him getting into the lake. Get into therapy. That would be him getting into the lake. Go to refuge recovery or Al-Anon or adult children. That's him getting into the lake. That's confronting his own unconscious dilemmas, his unexplored self. It's tough. It's taken me decades to learn some of this stuff and to know it and see it as clearly as I do. It doesn't mean that I'm without problems, because my family, I could line them up at the door and they would come in here if I let them and tell you where dad is imperfect and makes mistakes and is an idiot. But the clarity and the fundamental groundedness and the hope that comes from knowing that my project is to go into my dirty water and to sort it out. And like a lot of dreams, if I got into it, it won't kill me. I won't drown. It feels like I will, but I won't. All right. Somebody writes, I think there's another one. My son is home 5 months from Evoke and doing well. He doesn't want to be drug tested anymore and continue therapy. He feels it's not necessary anymore. The last few weeks we get into an argument when it's time for the drug test. How can I avoid confrontation and explain why it's necessary? He doesn't seem to hear anything I'm saying. You can't. That's the deal. You can't. I wouldn't advise you to try to get him. If I were advising him, I would say, give it your best shot. You know, tell your parents how they feel and tell them what you want. And you can even resist it and defy it if you want to. There'll be consequences, but the task isn't to get him to convince him to like it or to want it or to buy into it. The task is for you to set a boundary and to deal with those consequences. The best book for this question or the podcast is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. The talking him into it, the getting him to hear you, is trying to convince him and change his mind so you don't have to deal with the unpleasant realities that we all have to deal with when you have to set a boundary. And, ask yourself if you're open to negotiate, if you're open to give him a chance to sink or swim, as it were. But I think you sound like you're doing the right thing and you're getting back what kids that haven't matured give back. Or maybe there's a dialogue to be had there that you're willing to have to see if you can give them a little bit of extra rope. Someone asked, how do you see a young person enter the wellness program with no interest in the outdoors but become interested during the course of the program? How often do you see? Almost always, 80% at least. I always said about 80% of my students promised that they would come back and work. They all didn't, but that's how they felt about it by the time of departure. And at any given point, about 25% of our frontline staff are former clients or students. So usually, and even the ones who hated it up until the day they left. I can't tell you how common this is. It is so common. Will tell their parents or me or somebody days, weeks, months, years later, I wish I could go back. I wanted out, but there was something beautiful and simple about it. And they develop an affinity for what nature and the challenges of nature bring to them. So very, very, very often. Looks like that's all the questions. Thank you. I think we're up against the time anyway. So thank you for joining me. The next broadcast will be January 5th in the new year, 2021, at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be on Chapter 7 in my series going over the book, The Audacity to Be You. Chapter 7 is what to look for in a therapist, one of my most passionate subjects, one of the subjects I'm most passionate about. So looking forward to that. Thank you guys. Thank you for showing up, like I always say. Thank you for and in behalf of the people that love you and that you love for being willing to do your work and for making the principal project in your life you instead of them. Among many other things, that's what they need. They need you to know that your peace and serenity and well-being is your project, not theirs. So thanks for joining me this evening, folks. Take care. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.